So moving on to our next panel, with title Cyprus and its Geo-Economy, Challenges and Prospects. I'll give the floor to Professor Vassilis Monastiriotis from the London School of Economics, who will be moderating the discussion to present the speakers.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you for joining this session. My name is Vassilis Monastiriotis. I'm the Eleftherios Venizelos Chair of Contemporary Greek Studies at the London School of Economics. And I'm very, very pleased to be chairing this panel today. We heard a lot about the geopolitics of the region. Of course, this is and of Cyprus. This is the big issue, but we're going to try to focus it a bit more on the geo-economics of it. Of course, Cyprus is as an economist, I would say a small open economy. Some would call it an offshore economy, but it has significant dependencies and risks associated to its geographical position. Of course, the history, be it the relations with Russia, through the real estate market, the Middle East, in terms of energy, Israel, Egypt, and so forth, but also, of course, the vulnerabilities that have come out of Brexit. We're going to talk about some of these things. Cyprus is moving forward. It's moving forward in terms of policy. It's moving forward in terms of trying to move up the ladder in the value chain, if you want, with fintech and other emerging sectors. It is also moving forward in terms of its green transition. I think just yesterday we had the publication of the new strategy plan for the green transition by the Ministry of Energy. And of course, also it's moving on in its attempts to find new sources of growth and new sources of global competitiveness. Now, we cannot cover all these topics, so I'm preempting any disappointment, but we will touch upon most of these with four excellent speakers, with each of them with fantastic expertise on aspects of the things that we're going to talk about today. I'll present the speakers in the order that I will invite them to speak. To my left is Charles Grant. He's director of the Centre for European Reform, perhaps the most prominent in the UK think tank on Europe. His expertise covers the European Union, Russia, China, and global relations of China with the EU, and many other, actually, areas. Before joining the Centre for European Reform, he was bureau chief for the Economist in Brussels. He has served as director and trustee of the British Council from 2000 to 2008, and of the Digital Foundation from 2016 to 2022. He's a regular contributor to the Financial Times, and he's member of international advisory boards of many think tanks, including EDAM in Turkey, Terra Nova in France, the Italian Aspen Italia, and also our competitor at the LSE, the European Institute of the University College London. Our second speaker will join us online over Zoom. It is Cleopatra Kitti, who is a certified independent director and ambassador of the network of independent directors in Cyprus. Cleopatra has been advising governments, businesses, and international organizations for over 30 years on a range of issues: cross-border investments, EU regulation, governance, corporate governance, and many other things, in general, the geo-economics, specializing in Middle East, North Africa, and the Levant region. Importantly, she's founder of the Mediterranean Growth Initiative, a networking platform which provides real-time data analysis for the economies of the Mediterranean. And she's also a senior policy advisor at ELIAMEP, the Greek think tank, and co-founder of its Mediterranean program. Our third speaker will be live in person, Dr. Stelios Sakkas, who is a research economist at the University of Cyprus, affiliated with the Economics Research Center of the university. Stelios worked for a number of years before his current position. He worked as an economist at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in Seville, where he undertook academic and policy research on economic modeling, territorial data analysis, spatial general equilibrium analysis. He has a PhD and a postdoc from the Athens University of Economics and Business, and has published regularly in international academic journals, such as the European Journal of Political Economy, Regional Science and Urban Economics, Macroeconomic Dynamics, Journal of Economic Asymmetries, and more. And I think today he will present something which comes out of a project that he did with funding from the Hellenic Observatory at the LSE. So I had to mention that. I'm sure he will also mention it. Last but not least, again online via Zoom, would be Our fourth speaker, Loizou, who is co-founder and managing partner of Loizou and Company, a strategic consulting firm that provides consultancy obviously services and advice to firms internationally, but I think also with a lot of activity in Cyprus, at least currently. Louis has worked before his current position. He's worked in a number of financial institutions in the UK, Citigroup, Barclays, the Competition and Markets Authority, and also the Treasury here in the UK. He has served as chairman of the Hellenic Bankers Association in the UK, and he's currently chairman of the Hellenic Tech Network, a non-profit association which he co-founded in 2021, aiming at promoting a closer cooperation among professionals in technology companies and startups. He's a regular public speaker. He's given presentations at universities, including at the London School of Economics, and has published a number of articles in the Economist, Forbes, and elsewhere. Each with their own expertise, they will take us through some aspects of the geo-economics of the region. To open up the discussion, I'll pass the floor to Charles, who's going to give us the big picture, I think.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm not an expert on Cyprus, so I'm going to talk about the strategic challenges facing Cyprus, Britain, and the European Union in general. I think the sources of uncertainty are greater today than they've ever been before. I've been running my think tank for 26 years now, and I don't think the world has ever looked more uncertain. So let me mention 10 sources of uncertainty we have to think about. One is who's going to lead Europe. That perhaps is the least uncertain of the 10 things I'm going to mention, because I think Ursula von der Leyen is going to remain the President of the European Commission, probably. But the European elections do matter, because the far right is going to do quite well, and the centre-right is leaning to the far right in order to win back votes from the far right, which means that the European Parliament that will emerge in June will still be controlled by, if you like, the forces of moderation, the Christian Democrats, the Socialists, the Greens, and the Liberals. But it's going to be leaning more to the right than the current Parliament. So it's going to be much more hostile to green policies. It's going to be much tougher on migration. It's going to be more hostile to enlargement of the EU, and it's going to be more hostile to European integration generally. So it's going to be a different sort of European Parliament. Second source of uncertainty is obviously the war in Ukraine, which is much harder to read what's going to happen there. I think if Russia does quite well militarily in the next year or so, if Putin was clever, he could split the West. At the moment, the West and the Europeans have been pretty united on the war with Russia. They've all stood by Ukraine, more or less. But if Putin said, look, let's do a deal, I'll keep the bits of Ukraine I've got, Ukraine can keep the rest, then we'll call it a day and go home. Ukraine wouldn't like that, the Nordic and Baltic and Polish governments wouldn't like that, but quite a lot of European governments like France, Italy, Germany, Spain might say yes. Putin could split the Europeans by making such a proposal. I don't think there's no sign at the moment he wants to do that, but if he does, it could be dangerous for the West and for Europe as a whole. If he doesn't propose that, and there's no signs that he's going to, then I think the Europeans will stay behind Ukraine, backing it, mostly backing it, and the West will stay quite united. Third source of uncertainty, obviously, is Donald Trump. Nobody knows what he's going to do. None of us can be sure. But he's already weakened NATO by saying that he might not apply Article 5 of NATO to those countries that don't spend enough on defence. And he's already indicated that he would cut off American help for Ukraine, or some of that help for Ukraine. If Trump comes into the White House and does these things, and last time he was president, he almost pulled out of NATO, he will divide Europe. Most Europeans will be opposed to him, but some countries like Hungary, Slovakia, and maybe one or two others would actually try and be Trump's best friends. I think if Trump in the White House would lead to a lot more support for President Macron's ideas of strategic autonomy in Europe, the idea that Europe has to be able to look after its own affairs and without depending on others. The other point about Trump is, of course, he said he's going to put enormous tariffs against Europe and China, so he's going to start trade wars, which is bad for the European economy and the world economy. Fourth source of uncertainty, climate change. Trump, of course, doesn't believe climate change is a problem, so would pull out of the Paris agreements, which would have some impact. And I thought, as I've already said, I think the Europeans are going to be less keen to tackle climate change than in the past, because the political weather in Europe is moving away from caring about climate change. Public opinion isn't prepared to go much further in that direction. And it may become clear in the next few years that although climate change is happening, human beings are incapable of doing much about it, and we just have to live with it. However, the uncertainty there is actually China, because I was in China just a few weeks ago, and Chinese do care about climate change because a lot of their countryside is turning into desert, so maybe they can renew the global efforts to tackle it. Fifth source of uncertainty, China itself. The big question in China, as far as I'm concerned, is does it become part of an axis of autocracies, Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, working together against the West, against the Americans? Because the Ukraine war has rather pushed China into that position, because China is so worried about America and fears America threatening it that it feels it needs Russia as a friend. So the war has meant that China stands by Russia. But a lot of people in China are unhappy with that, and they speak out in public and say they don't want to be so close to Russia. They think Russia's a loser. They don't want to be so close to North Korea and Iran. So I think it's interesting to see how that develops. Many of the people I met in China think China should be a leader of the global south, not a leader of an axis of autocracies. But so long as the war continues, probably China will stay backing Russia. And there are, of course, huge economic tensions between the West and China as well. China is developing a huge trade surplus. It's going for economic growth by investing much more in green industries and other modern high-tech industries and trying to export the surplus to the rest of the world, which is creating tensions with the Europeans and Americans. So I think trade wars are quite likely, even if Trump doesn't come into office. Sixth source of uncertainty, the UK. There's going to be an election in the autumn. I think it's pretty clear we're going to have a new government, a Labour government. What is not certain is what that will do for Britain's relations with Europe. There are basically two rival camps within the Labour Party. There's one camp saying, don't talk about Europe. The Tories will attack us if we talk about Europe. We might not get back the voters who abandon us for the Tories if we talk about Europe. So don't talk about Europe and don't do too much about Europe. There's another camp that says the current relationship between Britain and the EU is defined by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It's very damaging to the British economy. We need a fundamental revisit of it. And they will say that the security pact that Britain is going to offer the Europeans, and this will happen if Labour is in power, should be balanced by a revisiting of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So Labour's divided on what to ask for. And when I talk to European governments about this, many of the French and the Commission say, let's do the trade, let's do the security pact, but let's not revisit the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, because it's a pain to do that, and we've done it and sorted it out long ago. However, Britain does have some friends in the EU, the Nordics, Baltics, Polish governments, and even I discovered last week when I was in Spain, the Spanish government would be prepared, I think, to reopen that trade agreement, but that's a source of uncertainty. I personally hope it is reopened. Seventh source of uncertainty, migration. Recently, the EU agreed something called the Migration and Asylum Pact, hoping to solve the problem of irregular migration coming into the European Union. It won't work, I'm afraid. It's a good idea, and I wish it well, but it still doesn't give, for my money, doesn't give the borderline countries like Italy and Greece enough incentives to hold on to the irregular migrants to come in and process them. So they'll still have incentives to let them drift into the rest of the EU, I think. And the so-called solidarity mechanisms are not really going to work, because countries like Poland and Hungary don't want them to work. So I'm fear that migration will remain a serious issue, boosting support for the far right all across Europe. Eighth source of uncertainty. How long do I have?
1.5 minutes.
Okay, I'll be fine. I've got 3 points left. Eighth source of uncertainty, Gaza. I'm not an expert on the Middle East, but I was recently talking to some people who were. They are pretty convinced that there's not going to be any kind of solution. The Israelis do not want a two-state solution. The Palestinians don't really want Israel to exist. So sadly, this conflict's going to go on and on and on as far as I can see. This is damaging to Europe, because Europe divides three ways on Gaza: those who support Israel, those who support Palestine, those who are in the middle. And it's very damaging to the West's reputation, Europe's reputation as well. Ninth point, France. So there's only 3 years to go to the next presidential election, but the bookmakers' favourite is Marine Le Pen. Opinion polls show if there was an election today between Macron and Le Pen would win. Le Pen says she doesn't want to leave the EU, but she says she wouldn't apply EU rules in France. So essentially she would disrupt the EU and try and destroy it from within. If she wins the presidency, which is quite possible, it'll be much worse for the EU than Brexit. It'll be the end of the EU as we know it, as far as I can see. Final source of uncertainty, Turkey. The current president of Turkey has caused a lot of damage to the West through helping Russia avoid sanctions, and through his generally stroppy behaviour in NATO, and for many other reasons as well. But as we learned recently in the local elections, there is perhaps a chance of a new government in Turkey in a few years. If we get a government that is more committed to respecting human rights, less keen to support Russia, and less overt in its support for Hamas, the EU will be ready to embrace Turkey and I think develop a much closer relationship, including in a new customs union. So those are 10 sources of uncertainty. And I think you'd agree with me that the world has never been more uncertain. Many of those sources of uncertainty are quite alarming and worrying, particularly if you look at France. But hopefully they're not all worrying, and hopefully we can cope with the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you for reminding us. I don't know if it's a very pleasant reminder, but indeed many uncertainties and risks. We'll try to zoom a bit more now to Cyprus. I would like to invite Cleopatra Kitti to speak to us, and I think it's going to be more focused on Brexit and the UK trade relations in the region.
From Nicosia, thank you, Nicolas Kyriakidis, for inviting me to this UK Cyprus Forum. Thank you, Professor Monastiriotis, for hosting me on this panel. It's always a tough act to follow after Charles Grant, but I'll try and set a different context. I'll focus a bit on data and analysis that is drawn from the Mediterranean Growth Initiative platform that gives a context of the geo-economics, the relations of UK in the Mediterranean. I heard a lot in the morning the discussion on the Mediterranean region and the UK. So how we define the Mediterranean, just to remind everybody, it's the EU Mediterranean, then it's Turkey, the Balkan Rim, the Levantine Basin, and all of North Africa. And in this region, we are 500 million people producing 10% of global GDP, but only a quarter of our trade is intra-regional. We're the least interconnected region in the world. And that adds to the complexity of conflict, maybe why we have intense conflict in the region, because the less we have to share in common, to co-produce and co-develop, the more prone we are to conflict. But I don't know if you see, I have two infographics to share with you. I don't know if it's visible. The graphic looks at the post or the UK relationship, trade relationship with the Mediterranean and the East Med. Our data is drawn from UN Comtrade and the Office of the National Statistics in the UK. So what we see is that trade between the UK and the Med, the blue line in the chart, had a pronounced drop in 2020, which was the year when Brexit became a reality and the pandemic began. This was also the case for UK and the East Med region, although the drop was milder. The trend indicates that the drop in trade between the UK and the Med region mainly involved countries outside the Eastern Mediterranean. The Eastern Mediterranean countries are worth reminding are those that the UK has historic ties that are strengthened now through the Commonwealth. Some of these countries in the post-Brexit era are re-import and re-export trade hubs for the UK, such as Turkey, Egypt, and to some extent Cyprus on some products, and we'll see that a bit later. Another key point to raise is the type of goods traded. The UK continues to trade in the traditional sectors of energy and automotive, whereas the UK imports from the East Med are very culture-centric, are handicraft goods, works of art, and manufactured art. One point to note is the way data is collected and represented, and UN Comtrade data includes the re-imports and the re-exports. Because since Brexit, the UK has set up key distribution and manufacturing hubs across the continent, which is a point of note why, as Charles said earlier, the UK might want and the Europeans might want to renegotiate or relook at the trade agreement with the UK, because it's not only the security aspect, it's the value chains in a new world of regional value chains and less globalized trade. Regionalization matters, and the EU Med for the UK is a valuable manufacturing and redistribution hub. So it's a point to consider as we look at the world coming up. Can we now move to the second infographic, please, which looks at UK and Cyprus. So look at the relations, the traditional relations here on trade. Cyprus, as was highlighted in previous panels, is the only isolated market in the EU. We don't have any infrastructure or interconnectivity with any other market in the region, whether it's energy or whether it's physical infrastructure or value chain infrastructure. The UK ranks 8th largest import partner to Cyprus, and it's Cyprus's 6th largest export partner, which is a drop from where it was prior to 2016. But apart from 2019, the UK has maintained a trade surplus with Cyprus, exporting more than it imports. The orange line, I don't know if you can see it. If somebody can confirm, you can see the second infographic. Yep. Can you see the second infographic? Yes. So the orange line, which is UK exports to Cyprus, and is above the green line, which is the UK imports from Cyprus. So imports from Cyprus experienced a sharper drop, and they are still on a very mild upward curve, which means Cyprus needs to try a little harder in its export relations with the UK to sharpen that upwards curve. And over the last 5 years, agricultural goods, dairy and vegetables, and jewelry have been Cyprus's exports to the UK. We've chosen the top 3. The 4th one is pharmaceuticals. And on the other hand, UK's exports to Cyprus have been vehicles and machinery, very traditional industrial trade goods. So to conclude, the Med is a key hub of trade post-Brexit for the UK in the redesign of UK value chains, either to re-import and re-export or to distribute goods, not just in the Med or in Europe, but globally. The East Med plays a bigger role than the rest of the Mediterranean for the UK, and Cyprus must try harder in its export profile to the UK to match the imports increase and a bit more, and to broaden its export profile. And with this, I conclude my comments. I hope I'm within my 8 minutes, Professor Monastiriotis. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Cleopatra. I know that we're a bit sensitive with time. I will invite now Stelios Sakkas to present. Louis, if that's okay, and then we'll move at the end with you. Yes, so Stelios, the floor is yours.
So this is a project that was under, let's say, the generosity of the Hellenic Observatory and the A.G. Levedis Foundation, run through last year, let's say. In a nutshell, what we did is we tried to simulate, if I may use the word, the effect of EU sanctions against Russia on the main macroeconomic variables of Cyprus's economy, from the short to the medium run overall. I will give you just a bit of motivation of this project, just to put things into context. So back then, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, when the war started, there was a lot of fuss in the press, in the local press, in the Cypriot press, and in the international press about the effect of sanctions on Cyprus' economy, given the fact that all of us that know how things are in Cyprus, the Russian economic activity is very strong. You can see this thing every day. So there were some bold statements in the press, like that Cyprus is confronting existential questions about its economy and things like that. So what will happen after? In essence, the aim of sanctions, as everybody knows, was to weaken Russia's economic base and deprive it of critical technologies and markets. If the sanctions work For the good or bad, it's another discussion. I have a reference here from a very recent one from a column in The Economist. Anyway, this is another discussion. The main thing is that from this point and after, there were winners and losers, if I might say. What I want to say by this is that, of course, Cyprus, I mean, trade policies in the mandate of the European Commission, Cyprus had to align with the decisions of the European Commission and the member states, of course, and they had to implement these policies. Initially, everybody thought that these sanctions would have a great negative impact on EU's GDP, especially for Germany and neighboring countries like Poland and the Baltic states. 2 years after, it proved that was not the case, because on the one hand, Germany and Europe tried, to substitute energy and decrease energy consumption. This tend to have a mild negative impact on GDP. Also, the weather was helping in this direction. It is unfortunate that climate change helped in this aspect, but it did, given the temperature. The question here is how Cyprus relates to all this, and if it is different. And my answer, and probably your answer, would be yes, it is, because Russia is Cyprus' strongest partner in terms of trade and FDI. And when I talk about trade, I mainly focus on export of services. I will show you now some data that prove this thing, but before showing the trade data, I would just like to focus on the first, let's say, the direct impact of the war. As you know, just a bit before the war, we had also inflationary pressures coming from the COVID period, and this aggravated the sanctions policy in the war, aggravated the effect, as you will see, around January 2022 and after. Inflation increased a lot, not only in Cyprus, but in Europe as well. So that was let's say, an indirect effect of sanctions and the war. And the more direct effect, you can see it here. I have some data here. You have to dig deeper in the balance of payments accounts of Cyprus with Russia. Just focus, for the sake of time, on the orange bar. The orange bar represents the services, the export and imports of services from and to Russia, of course. And if you see what happened from 2021, the year before the war, and the year after the war, you will see that the orange bar is almost halved in terms of exports. Oops. I'm sorry, here, in terms of exports. This means, if you want to translate it in another way, that exports of services to Russia accounted initially for the 1/4 of total export of services. This was around 9% of the GDP in 2021, and now it's around 4% of GDP. This, of course, is a major shock in terms macroeconomically speaking. If you want to look at it in another way, if you want to see other kind of services like tourism, tourist arrivals, you can see that, of course, they were decreased during the COVID time. Then people from Russia stopped visiting the island. And again, this is reflected in all the time series available up to 2022. We still wait for the 2023 data. Last one, in terms of FDI, there is also the Russian presence in terms of FDI was traditionally strong. But as you can see, again, focus on 2022, inward and outward FDI. By inward, I mean flows coming from Russia. They decreased. They are negative, actually, meaning that there is a disinvestment. So all in all, 2 minutes. Fine. All in all, we took this data. We have a model at the University of Cyprus, of the Economics Research Center, that tries to simulate and forecast the effect of such policy changes on the main macroeconomic variables. And from our calculations, all in all, very briefly, I can say that the Cyprus GDP, real GDP, falls by 5.5% the first years. But if you want to look at an average pace, let's say, it will drop for around. It will drop by drop. I mean it will slice GDP by 2%, more or less. Macroeconomically speaking, this is not a small number. It's quite something to lose your 2% of your GDP in just two or 3 years. And perhaps this partly explains the observed growth slowdown of the Cypriot economy from a 5.5% in 2022. The last year was only 2.3% growth rate of GDP. Now we'll close with some general conclusions and some remaining challenges. Of course, the effects are not negligible. We have to to examine them a bit in more detail. Uncertain for how long and how strong they will be, because these people know here better than me, this depends on the geopolitical context. Other mechanisms are in play, like export reorientation, export substitution. So you lost a bit of your financial exports. You can substitute them with tourism or with other destinations, other markets. A question here is, do you substitute with other markets, or still you have a relationship with Russia through other markets? It's a standard practice. Firms try to implement sanction avoidance practices sometimes. Finally, this is, let's say, my opinion. Of course, there are some equity concerns of EU sanctions policy because Cyprus has been hit disproportionately relative to what happened to the rest of the EU. And finally, I will close with some challenges and vulnerabilities that are still taking place. Of course, Cyprus, macroeconomically speaking, has still a very high current account deficit. This is a burden for the economy. Net international investment position is like more, I think, 100% of the GDP. Households and non-financial corporations are still indebted, more than 150% of the GDP, plus the share of non-performing loans, even though it's going down now. And why I'm saying this? Because now with the sanctions, of course, and the effect of sanctions of the economy, this puts additional borrowing and financial constraints in the economy. So if you have capital flying out of the economy, this reduces the collateral available in the economy. This makes borrowing much more difficult. So it remains to be seen what will happen in the future. You can find the results in a forthcoming working paper of the Hellenic Observatory. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stelios. A round of applause also for the previous speakers. I think this takes us very much then to this macroeconomic picture takes us then to the question about business and what is the investment environment in Cyprus, what is the business confidence about Cyprus, and perhaps how this is all seen from London. So, Louis, the floor is yours.
So, following on from the previous speakers, I will adopt a micro perspective, discuss some of the sectors that they are promising in Cyprus and what business opportunities they are there, but at the same time touch base on threats and how things will look with the prospects also of a further development in the political problem that Cyprus has been facing. Now, in terms of how the outsiders look Cyprus, I would like to focus on a sector which is of paramount importance, that's tourism and hospitality. I would like to put this into perspective and say that Cyprus has almost 4 million tourists a year. And to compare this with Greece's largest market, Crete has 5 million tourists a year, and Corfu, an important destination in Greece, has 2 million tourists. The opportunity here is to upgrade the top end of the market and five-star hotels. And we have examples with resorts, City of Dreams, for example, in Limassol, which has been built by international player Melco. And the threat in this environment and in this sector will be mostly the cyclicality of tourism and hospitality. It's driven by local and regional uncertainties. And just to mention a point here that has also been touched base upon previously with the previous speakers, in COVID years, tourism was below 1 million tourists in that year. Now, I would also like to include in the development of infrastructure, the residential and commercial infrastructure. We have witnessed the last years the transformation of Limassol to a modern city that is developing into a regional business hub. It's good to put into perspective that the air flight time from Larnaca to Tel Aviv is approximately an hour, and 1 hour and a half to Cairo, which provides an opportunity for Cyprus to attract individuals that would like to have business on the island, and reminds me how people that they're outside of London and also people outside the UK have London as a second home for business as well. And at the same time, the threat here is that Cyprus, and especially Limassol, is becoming more expensive for locals, and at the same time, consumption is not driven by domestic demand, but is driven by foreign demand, and that may create an uneven pattern of consumption. Going and moving on to two other more important sectors is the educational and the medical sector. In the educational sector, we have the opportunity for Cyprus to attract the boarding school market. It's hosting important schools like Vassilis, an English school, the secondary education level, lower fees compared to private schools in the UK, but with no compromise on quality. And we have seen recently activity in the space with the acquisition of a chain of 11 schools with campuses in Nicosia, Limassol, and Larnaca by the global players Globe Educate. We have also seen activity in the medical sector with global partners like CVC, private equity, acquiring hospitals in Cyprus and creating more of a modern hospital market. And of course, at the same time, we have the threat that this may create more monopolies in the local market. And if you allow me, Professor Monastiriotis, a final comment. I believe the prospects of potential unification of the island represents the greatest opportunity of all, and especially for those players who will be well positioned beforehand. And I believe, that's my personal view, that the energy companies, that they already operating the companies in Cyprus, there are some important ones like Eni, Total, ExxonMobil. They know that very well, and that the opportunity in the energy sector, even synergies, it will be much bigger than it looks like today. And I believe that will be new players emerging in tourism infrastructure, hospitality, educational, and medical infrastructure, raising the game of business in Cyprus, raising the profile of Cyprus, but at the same time, raising the profile of the Eastern Mediterranean region. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. And thanks to all for keeping with time, actually, excellently. I know two of our speakers are in a rush to go, so before opening to the floor, I'll just do a very quick, actually one quick question. We heard that there's sectors that, if you want sectors of growth, the last presentation, obviously international firms coming into the island and probably discounting a future solution to the Cyprus problem, which is going to boost, of course, the economy, at least from an international perspective. We heard that there's deficits with the UK, but also potential to operate as a trade hub for re-import, re-export. We heard also that there's kind of, macroeconomic imbalances that can be worrying, and of course we heard that there's a plenty of risks in the global economy. Anyway, I would like to ask the question in two forms. I think for Cleopatra, Luis, and Stelios, the form would be, if we take seriously this idea about supply chains and how Cyprus can re-specialize from kind of traditional tourism to pharma, fintech, medical tourism, combining real estate with other services, and so forth. How possible is that, given the size of the island, and in that sense also the capacity of governance, the capacity of the local economic ecosystem to support this transition and so forth? And then my question to Charles would be, how likely would you say is that, or how relevant is that in the grand scheme of things? Is it ever possible for a place like Cyprus to avoid or to prepare better for all these risks that you listed by re-specializing, and as academics would say, position yourself in the global supply chain and you're going to be all right? Is that relevant from the grand perspective? I think I would like Charles, without giving you much time to think of the question, to respond to that, and then pass on the floor to Louis, Cleopatra, and then Stelios.
I think Cyprus is very well placed to do exactly as you suggest, because it's a small country. Small countries can shift more easily and develop new industries and new strategies and new policies much more easily than big countries, and it's well placed. I think it has many attributes that are required for such a shift. Perhaps I can also add, when I mentioned Turkey earlier, I didn't say how that related to Cyprus, but I think one of the conditions that the European Union has set for a better relationship with Turkey isn't just improving its human rights work, it's also talking to Cyprus meaningfully. And the EU is not going to abandon that demand of Turkey. So I think a new Turkish government is more likely to say yes to that than the current Turkish government. So I think that if we get a new Turkish government, we can get a very beneficial, virtuous circle starting with a better relationship between the European Union and Turkey, and Cyprus also benefiting from that. So I hope that would happen.
Even with Marine Le Pen in the presidency in Paris?
If Marine Le Pen's in the presidency in Paris, the EU will not exist in its current form, which is something we can talk about another time, perhaps. But I think she would try and destroy it from within. By the way, she's not Maloney. I've met Marine Le Pen. I spent an evening with her once a few years ago. Maloney's quite cleverly repositioned herself as somebody who was from the far right, who's moved to the centre and become a fairly moderate, at least on foreign policy. I don't think Le Pen is the same case. I think Le Pen is actually remains an extremist who's pretending to be moderate in order to win the election. I think when if she does win the French presidential election, she will turn out to be very disruptive indeed of NATO and the European Union.
Thank you. We'll leave that for the future discussion. Louis, is it easy? It's a small economy, so it's easy to re-diversify. Do you think that the investment flows and the interest is such that it allows this possibility?
Sure. The diversification opportunity for Cyprus is an important one. And diversifying away from tourism and the service sector will be of paramount importance. I would also like to mention that Cypriots are very hardworking and very diligent in terms of doing stuff, and I believe that having the past behind, things can move on and become really promising from both macro and micro perspective.
Good. Okay, we're turning to positive messages then. Cleopatra, can you continue on the positive message? Is the trade relations with the UK a path to this diversification?
Well, yes, I think the lens that Cyprus needs to shift, it's connectivity, both physically but also virtually. It needs to get onto projects that interconnected regionally and interconnected physically to the continent, whether that's more connectivity via air and sea, or transmission projects like the one that is being discussed with Saudi Arabia to Greece through Cyprus. We need to get interconnected. And also we need to look at that interconnectivity, how we grow the pie of the business that is not just the inland economy, the economy we already have, and how we attract people, but it's how we interconnect it maybe more as a confidence building measure with Turkish Cypriots, the Green Line Agreement, how we make most of it, how we begin to open up a dialogue with other countries in the region to interconnect, as I said, physically and virtually. So I think and that can go in every category. It could go to tourism, produce tourist products that connect our tourism to other countries in the region, Egypt, for example, and Greece, or it could be the hospital care, wellness, that how we connect that to the Gulf region or to more neighboring countries. So it's the flow of capital, it's the interconnectivity, It's connecting ourselves to other projects. It's the Green Line Agreement with Turkish Cypriots. It's a lot of other projects like that. So how do we shift the lens of thinking outside what we already have and what we already know? And I leave it at that.
Thank you, Cleopatra. Very, very good points. Stelios?
Yes, so I have some good points and some bad points, if I might say. The good point is that, from what I know and from my own research, let's say, what I realized is that Cyprus has a very big stock, let's say, of knowledge in terms of financial services, tourism services, and expertise. So it should exploit this much better, in a much better way, diversify, try to find other markets. So not only business with Russia, which I suppose it was a good thing. The flow of money was enormous, but still, if you have this knowledge, this capacity, you can find and invest in other markets. Possibly other sectors, like Louis said, AI, the tech sector, and so on. Of course, another positive is that it's very well placed, as Charles said. If you are small, you are flexible, and you can change easily. Another positive thing that I see in the future is positive if and only if they, let's say, have a swift implementation, a rapid implementation of the recovery and resilience plan of Europe. That is the funds coming from Europe. If and only if they invest it in the correct way. In the correct way, meaning that you have to implement the necessary reforms in the state in order to make the business environment even more attractive, and so on. I will put an asterisk in this point, because I think a major drawback of Cyprus is the justice system and how the justice system works. I was looking in the data for our own research mostly, and what I found is that it takes like 1,000 days to resolve a case, either commercial, civil, administrative, or whatever. That is 3 years for a simple case. So how can you attract business if it takes 3 years to resolve a very simple case? So I'm positive that with the reforms implemented in the near future, these things will improve, but it remains to be seen as well.
Very good. Indeed, we had a bit of a discussion yesterday at the networking dinner, talking about reforms and how things, in a way, block the growth potential and the diversification potential of the economy. So I think that gives us the opportunity to open to the floor for your questions. I can say we only have 6-7 minutes, and yes, I think Charles will have to leave here. Thank you, Charles, for the contribution, and we'll see you in the next event. Thank you very much. And Louis, I don't know if when you need to leave, we'll also let you go as well. Thank you for joining us. Yep. Open to your questions. I know Alexandros, but please identify yourself very, very briefly and ask a question.
Yes, my name is Alexandros, fellow at the London School of Economics and founder of International Relations. So, two very quick questions. The first is, one of the key challenges that small states have in dealing with the global economy is their interconnection and their lack of economies of scale. So, given this challenge of lacking economies of scale, how do you see Cyprus being able to circumvent that if it goes into new sectors? Secondly, given the unrest in the Middle East, we've seen an upgrowth in investments from countries, particularly from Israel, potentially from Lebanon, in the region, in Cyprus. So how does that factor in? Can that play a mitigating role in the loss of flows of capital from Russia? Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Any other questions? Not for, yes?
Theodoros Theodorou. My area is transnational education, but I also have another hat, coordinator of Lobby for Cyprus. We talked a lot about the potential in Cyprus for all types of industry, commerce, IT, and so forth. We haven't talked about the human resources. I think that's an element that our government has to look at carefully and build skills by training and so forth for the long term, with 5 or 10 years ahead. What we want is our domestic kids to be able to be trained up, not only looking at bringing in skill sets from abroad. So does anyone know what our government is actually focusing on that? My second question is regarding education. The UK basically has over £35 billion of money, let me call it part of the trade, that is received from international students studying in the UK. Cyprus should develop its education sector as a hub, just like other countries in Dubai, Mauritius, and so forth, by having a university hub. And I think that's another important. I know that other universities have just established in Cyprus, the American University in Beirut and so forth, but I see that as also a long-term strategy for bringing in income into Cyprus.
Okay, very good. Thanks. I think, because I know Luis may have to go quickly, Luis, would you like to pick up on any of the points, perhaps this thing about whether, flows of investment from other places or the economies of scale, but also any other point that you want?
Sure, thank you. So if I briefly mention a point on the economies of scale.
Yeah.
Will we say that Luxembourg, for example, lacks economies of scale? Maybe, but Luxembourg is very well positioned to serve the middle market and some of the large companies in terms of capital markets and fixed income specifically. So it's a matter of how you package and how you present your product to get attention first from your region and then from a global audience. And on the education point, yes, I will agree with that. It's a well set point, and not only the higher education, but also the secondary schools. It's an important part of the education. And I believe there are capital inflows from education in Cyprus, and definitely it can be increased. Thank you, Professor Monastiriotis.
Thank you, Louis, and thank you for joining us, and see you in the next event, if I may. I'll pass the floor to Cleopatra. Cleopatra, maybe, also speak, of course, on the economies of scale question, but also on the capital flows and other flows from other countries in the broader region.
Yeah, so to the point on education, actually education is a rising sort of sector in the total economy of Cyprus. It now represents 6% of our GDP with a growth potential, and it is a sector where we see more interconnectivity, sort of more educational institutions, not just establishing themselves in Cyprus, but Cypriot universities establishing themselves in other jurisdictions. So there is some flow of capital and private equity investing in Cypriot educational institutions is a recent development. Just to remind that Cyprus is Europe's southeastern border or southeastern market. Where there is potential is for more European capital, whether it's through private equity or multilateral partnerships to come into the using Cyprus as a hub of projects into the region. I think that's still to be tapped into, but also using Cyprus as an interconnector point, whether physically again or financially, because we are a European jurisdiction. It is British law here, and there is more potential for Cyprus to serve both capital markets from London, but also European capital markets into the region. So that's still untapped. I don't know if there's anything else you would like me to build on, but I think as a final point, it's a good point to make.
I think it's a very good point. We'll make sure the policymakers have their ears open and we can pass on some of this discussion. Stelios, I'll give you also the ugly task of having to tell us about the human resources and developing the skills domestically.
So these are more of personal opinions rather than research-based, and from what I know from my experience in the island, I would say if you see what happens in the higher education sector, I think Cyprus does, has done a pretty good job. Like 30 years ago, there was not a university in Cyprus. Now the state university, the University of Cyprus, is a center of excellence. It attracts a lot of money, faculty, and people from abroad. Also Cypriots return, and also Greeks want to go. Myself, you want to go to work there. It's a very good place for research environment as well. Where I see a problem is on the secondary education mostly. If you check what happens on the PISA scores, for example, the test results for Cypriot students are quite bad. I mean, quite bad for Greek students as well, but this tells us something. I mean, how do you connect secondary education and then how do you feed your higher education system with people from your country? I mean, if you see also what happens now, Cyprus tries to attract, for example, Greek students to Cypriot universities through part-time programs, distance learning and things like that. And if you check the statistics, you will see that, for example, 60% of the master students are foreigners. In fact, they aren't foreigners, they are Greek students who are enrolled part-time. So there are many tricks that, tricks in this procedure, but I see the major problem in the secondary education and this upskilling or building skills from the base. One thing that I know is that, through the recovery and resilience plans, again, a major component is this upskilling of your human capital. Again, I want to be positive that there will be a real upskilling in the next years, because other than that, then you will have to rely only on the outside market.
Right, thank you very much. We've gone past our time, so let me wrap it up. I think it works very well. Usually I'm in more bleak conversations, but we started with the 10 deadly challenges of the global economy with SARS, but we were quite able to identify good things and good prospects for the Cypriot economy. It needs European money, investments, capital flows, private, public. Reforms instigated or supported by the European Union through the RRF and the Next Generation EU or whatever follows next, but it also needs interconnectivity, it needs to diversify, it has the potential, it is in a very sensitive region, but also it is, that gives opportunities to exploit synergies, to exploit potentials with neighbors, both immediate neighbors and further afield. We need to stop here. Thank you all for your attention, and please join me in thanking our contributors today.